Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to you. My name is Andrew Lawton. This is Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. Such a pleasure to have you joining me today. We've got a great podcast up ahead. We're going to be chatting later on with Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. He is one of America's most famous rabbis, one of the world's most famous rabbis. Actually, he's the only rabbi I can name, so that's how well known he is. But he is speaking in Toronto, or at least by the time this comes out, has spoken in Toronto, and I had the opportunity to speak with him before his talk, and unfortunately I wasn't able to have this interview come out before the talk, just given our publication schedule here, but had the opportunity to really get into some detail with him about the issues pertaining to Israel and its place in the world, and things like boycott, divestment, sanctions, things like anti-Semitism. And I'm going to chat with him later on in the program. You'll hear that interview, which was absolutely phenomenal. This is a man who's been the spiritual advisor to Michael Jackson. I mean, they don't just hand out that title to everyone. Also going to be talking later on to fellow Rebel Rick McGinnis. He's the editor of the Rebel blog Megaphone. We'll be chatting with him about movies and Dustin Hoffman's recent comments that, well, you know, Hollywood just doesn't make them like it used to anymore. That's coming up later on as well. And lots more stuff. Wanted to begin, though, discussing this latest push-pull report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Now, this is, make no mistake, a left-wing hack group, if ever there was one. And it recently put out a study on the, quote, best and worst places to be a woman in Canada. Unquote. That's the name of the study. Very little nuance there. The best and worst places to be a woman in Canada. And, of course, the left-wing Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives decided it would target Alberta, specifically the cities of Calgary and Edmonton, as being among the poorest places in the country to have two X chromosomes. Now, they've looked at this gender gap, you know, basically quality of life between men and women in 5 areas: economic security, leadership, health, personal security, and education. Calgary comes in at 23, Edmonton comes in at 24, and cities like London, my city, was the 7th for the country, but the top in Ontario, Gatineau, Quebec, was at the top of the list. And at the bottom of the list was Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge. So an hour away from London, but clearly a lot more poorly performing on the survey here. Now, I wanted to debunk a few of the myths in the survey here first off, because I had the opportunity recently on my show that I'm guest hosting out in Calgary on News Talk 770 to speak with a feminist gender studies professor out there, Dr. Christina Stasia, who said that this in a lot of ways comes down to the wage gap, and a lot of ways it comes down to not having a national child care strategy. And when you look at the fact that Gatineau and Quebec were near the top of the list, and these are obviously cities that are involved in the Quebec government's healthcare strategy, she says that's why Alberta, which doesn't have it, is performing so poorly. But I think it's also important to note here that Alberta has one of the most, well, is the most natural resource-rich province in Canada, which means that you have a lot of the workforce in Alberta employed in the oil and gas sector pays very, very well. And let's face it, it's not exactly a female-dominated industry. Women don't want to be working outside in minus 30-degree weather on a warm day. And I find it interesting, very, very interesting, that this study is looking at this so-called problem. And I think we should be getting rid of the identity politics and instead focusing on making the quality of life better for everyone in Canada, not just one sex. And some would say, well, how does this study do anything but that? Well, simply put, because they're not contextualizing what some of these issues are if you were to look at how men fare in them. They're not saying the best and worst places to live in Canada. They're saying the best and worst places to be a woman. And it all comes back to a wage gap. which has been proven in study after study after study in Canada and the U.S. to be a myth. Because the one thing that the wage gap doesn't take into consideration is that men work longer hours. Men work longer hours, men work more hours per week, men work longer days. So that takes into consideration a lot of the so-called gaps that exist when you look at different sectors. Secondly, when you look at the wage gap and you take out childlessness, or you take out having a child, rather, and look just at childless men and childless women, the wage gap all but disappears. If you go one step further and look at the wage gap for people living in cities without children, women actually make more than men in the same job. So it's not that some hiring manager is sitting down, looking at a male candidate, looking at a woman candidate, and saying, you have a vagina? All right, I'm going to pay you 77 cents on the dollar. Yet constantly we're bombarded with, these little pop-up restaurants in the U.S. where they're going to charge women less because they're trying to make a point, and people in Canada that say, equal pay for equal work. Well, yeah, then work equal hours. Work in equal sectors. Because the fact is, I've heard anecdotal evidence and seen statistical evidence that reinforces that even though there may have been a gap in the past, it doesn't exist now. If you take a 45-year-old man and a 45-year-old woman and you put them against each other in a job, the man might be making more. Well, one of the big reasons for that, as all of these studies have reinforced, is that there's a good chance the woman, if she has 3 kids, has 3 years less experience than the man does in her job. Mothers have to make a sacrifice for their kids or their career, one or the other. Fathers have to do it too in some cases, but most couples will decide to have the mother take on that role. And what a lot of these people that tout the importance and significance of the wage gap fail to realize is that so much of this comes down to the fact that couples and parents have choices that they get to make. And most women with whom I've spoken, and not all women by any stretch, but most women like being the ones that get to focus on being a mother rather than being an employee for that time. And yeah, their careers take a hit. And I'm not denying that there might be subtle biases if you're looking at people hiring, and that if you're looking at 2 candidates at the age of, 25 or 26 that are entering the workforce, I would be, as a manager, and I don't even want to say this on the record, because if I'm ever ending up in a position where I need to hire people, this will come back to bite me in the butt. But I would find it hard to not be a little bit reticent. Just a little bit, if the candidates were equally hired about hiring a female, because I would be thinking, oh my goodness, is she going to be taking a year off next year? And I'm not saying that's right, but I am saying that I think it's a reasonable response. I mean, you look at many workforces where that can be very disruptive, and then you hire another candidate to come in and fill the year, and the person wants to come back, and, well, they're a year behind. And it's illegal to deny them the right to come back to their job, a lot of people think, but it depends on the province. In Ontario, people don't realize that you don't really have much protection against wrongful termination. And I think, companies can make these decisions for themselves. Unfortunately, we have human rights commissions that say that's not the case. One of the other things that the study looked at was violence against women. Well, for whatever reason, absent is the detail that Statistics Canada has determined and released based on 2009 numbers, the most recent available, that the rate of spousal abuse against men is only a tiny percentage behind the rate of spousal abuse for women. 601,000 instances, reported incidents of spousal violence against women in 2009. In that same year, there were 588,000 against men. That's a difference that is within the margin of error for a study of that nature. So when we look at saying, or numbers saying, and studies saying, and reports saying that, the areas of women's shelters are underserved, I'd say, how many men's shelters are there? Now, I don't think this needs to be an us against them thing. I don't think we need to be saying one is better than the other. No, we should be working to end violence against all people and increasing resources available to all people. But it's very disingenuous for the CCPA to come out with this basically evidence or grounds for man-hating nonsense by saying how difficult it is to be a woman in Canada, unless you're in Victoria or Gatineau or Montreal. Calgary Council Drew Farrell said the oil industry explains why Calgary and Edmonton have been so poor on it. He said men hold 88% of the jobs in construction. 76% of the jobs in the extractive sector. These are among the highest paying jobs in the province of Alberta. What I find interesting is that they're also acknowledging that women are among the most highly educated in the cities ranked, with 28% holding university degrees, several points higher than the number of men that do. That's because men don't need university degrees to work in the oil and gas sectors in a lot of cases. And let's face it, it's not like it used to be where university degree holders were making more money. No, you've got a lot of people that are making great deals of money in blue-collar work without university degrees. So just because a woman is educated and making less doesn't mean there's a wage gap. It means, hey, maybe we should be encouraging all people, men and women, to find work outside of the jobs that necessarily require a university degree. And then they're looking at numbers of women serving in government. Well, that's going to be fluid. And when you're looking at city councils that have, 20, 30 people on them, I'm not sure that's enough of a representative sample to really extrapolate that a city is not woman-friendly from a leadership capacity, but that's exactly what's going on here. And this report came out on Wednesday. And you know what? What I find fascinating about this is that so many people have, within hours of its release, used this as evidence of, this rampant sexism or anti-woman culture that exists in Canada. Well, I'm going to withhold any judgment until I see the best and worst places to be a man in Canada. Let's face it, mental health care in Canada is an underfunded and underserved area. Men stand to lose the most when you look at suicide rates. That's an issue that is easily male-dominated, with teenage men 15 times as likely to end their life by some numbers I've seen, and obviously that goes up and down, as women in the same age gap, and even older men. When you have burdens of fatherhood and providing for your family and being the breadwinner. I mean, these are stresses that, because of the fact that there is a family dynamic that exists in most parts of the West, that men have that role, there are added stresses that a lot of people have said contribute to mental health being more predominant in men. I guess that's why they call it mental health. No, I'm not even going to try. I feel like you got to get the cheesy, drum roll in the background on that. But here's the problem, or one of the many problems with this, is that you could talk about why it's terrible to be a black person in Canada. And a lot of the issues that they face are going to be the same as a white person faces. I mean, a lot of the issues that are cited here about issues that women are facing in Canada, in Calgary, Edmonton, Kitchener, Waterloo, are the same issues that men are facing. But when you're only shining the light on half of the equation, you're really not doing much to address the broader issue. Yet people eat this stuff up hook, line, and sinker. And you know what? When I talked about this on the air, the most vocal critics of the report were women that have said they're sick and tired of this nonsense, sick and tired of this me attitude, this belief that they're somehow given an unfair shake at life. Women have said, we have to make a choice. And women do have to make a choice. Any parents have to make a choice about whether or not they want to be the ones that stay home and look after their kids. Maybe they want to outsource and hire a daycare provider. Maybe they want to split up parental leave. The mom will do 6 months, the dad will do 6 months. Or maybe they want to have a family that goes against the grain and the dad will be the stay-at-home dad for the first few years of his child's life. But there's no law on the books that says the opposite needs to be true. The fact that most women naturally gravitate towards that role should tell us that maybe this is an issue that's more biological than political, or at the very least cultural, but even then, it's still something that's accepted without issue by so many women. And listen, I've talked to lots of women that would say they would love the opportunity, if they had the ability financially, to be stay-at-home parents. I don't think it's really fair that we have so many feminists that are projecting the fact that they don't want that onto the women who do, and telling them that their choice is wrong, as though there's something inherently sexist or submissive involved in wanting to be a good mother for your children. When in history did that become settling? When did wanting to be an amazing mother become a bad thing? It's been gradual. My mother worked shift work when I was old enough, but she stayed home, and I ended up absolutely fine. And I wouldn't have faulted her if she had made a different decision. I think children need to be around at least one parent rather than just having home care. But I understand parents that don't want to lose too much of their career because eventually the kids are going to grow up and, let's face it, be pretty darn expensive, and they'll need to have a well-paying career to fund, the kid's new car, the kid's school trips to like Paris or whatever. But here's my question to any of those. Why is that not an acceptable choice for a parent? And this is the problem with a lot of reports like this. And look, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is not the first to do this. And they won't be the last. As a matter of fact, they do it every year because this is the narrative that we need to keep fighting against. And, good for the city of Edmonton. They moved up from 25 to 24 in the last year. And the report doesn't really talk about the benefits that Edmonton women have seen, enough to get them from, being in the worst city in Canada for women to the second worst city in Canada. But I think every parent should have their choices recognized. The choices they have in deciding, first off, whether or not to be a parent. And beyond that, whether or not you want to be a stay-at-home parent, whether or not you want to work a little bit and look after your kids, or whether or not you want the other parent to deal with it. There's no rule book that says the woman has to be the one to stay home. There's no rule book that says no one can stay home or that both parents can't stay home. Maybe you work from home. Maybe you have investment income, or maybe you just are one of these, lucky darn, 0.1%ers that can just stay home for a couple of years and not have to worry about it. Not everyone is going to have ideal circumstances. In fact, most people won't. That's a reality of life. But it's very, very, I don't even like using the word because of the implications it has, but offensive to parents that do make that decision, which is a tough decision to walk away from work, even for a small period of time to look out for your kids, that is supposed to be now looked down upon. And that women should be ashamed of that very difficult decision if they do choose to take it is horrible. And I've known fewer examples, but there have been examples of men, fathers that have made that decision as well. I know one person whose wife is a teacher, and he works in a job that he likes and he went to school for, but it's not as well paying as it. And, they picked up and moved between provinces for it because they knew that this was going to be a better option for her. And frankly, I found what was really interesting about that is that he's ended up being, in a lot of cases, the caretaker of their two children. He works part-time and he looks after them, and obviously, in the summer months, she's got a little bit more time, but they at least have an arrangement that works for them. And I don't buy anyone telling other parents how their lives should be, how their parenting styles should be when it comes to who's the one doing it. I don't think it's really that off base to say that mothers and fathers are different. They both bring different things to the table. And obviously, you're going to have some mothers that have more paternal instincts, and you're going to have some fathers that have more maternal instincts. But I think for the most part, most kids want to run to their mom if they're feeling upset, then they're going to want to run to their dad. Now, I don't know why that is. And I know that kids are different as well. Like there's a family at my church, the girl, whenever she's crying, and her mom's holding her, she's reaching out to her dad wanting him. My nephews, they like both. All I know is they definitely cry when I'm holding them. I am never the one they're looking for. So I understand that perhaps I just don't have the magic touch in that area. But they get to make decisions as parents, and I don't know why we need to be shying away from this. Now, we've got to take a break here in just a moment. I find it interesting, though, just before I go, that this study that's supposed to be looking at 5 different areas, economic security, leadership, health, personal security, education, it all comes down to a wage gap. That's the biggest takeaway from this, that puts the ones that are at the bottom, and violence against women. Well, just because you don't have enough resources to cover that issue with the ground that you'd like doesn't mean that that's a woman's rights issue. No, that's a healthcare funding issue. And the fact is, in our healthcare system, there are lots of things that I would love to get more funding if we are going to maintain the belief that healthcare should be universal, like mental health care, like cutting down wait times, like all of these other areas. But again, the question wasn't asked of whether or not all Canadians have the access to health care they need. The question wasn't asked about whether or not all Canadians who experience violence have the resources they need, whether all Canadians have the right to run for elections. Just because there are fewer women on city councils doesn't mean women don't have the right to seek those. It just means that they're not the ones getting elected because they're not the ones running. This is not evidence of sexism. This is evidence that women see these things in a different light than men do. And that's not wrong. That's just reality. We've got to take a break. When we come back in just a couple of moments, we're going to be chatting with Rabbi Shmuley Boteach about Israel and BDS and anti-Semitism in Canada. That's coming up. And later on, lots more fun here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. Stay with us, friends. We'll be right back in just a moment. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.media.
Welcome back to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.media. This segment is a really fun one. Now, this week on Wednesday, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach had the chance to speak, or I should say everyone in attendance had the chance to hear him speak, to a group about Israel, about anti-Semitism, about boycott, divestment, sanctions, and so on. The movement rooted in a lot of cases, anti-Semitism, rampant anti-Semitism that exists on Canadian campuses. And I had the opportunity before his remarks to speak to him about his remarks, but about his work in general. Now, this is a man who's known as America's Rabbi. He's appeared on shows like Oprah and media outlets around the world, but specifically in North America. He's authored over 30 books to do with things like love, relationships, sex, Jesus, and he's tackled some very big questions in his career and in his writings. And I wanted to chat with him about this one, which is not to me a Jewish issue solely. I mean, this is something that exists in so many different realms. And I was glad that on my radio show on AM 980, I had the chance to chat with him and share that interview with you here today. I didn't get a chance to hear the speech, but I heard it was very well received. So I hope to see the video on that at some point. That was brought to Canada by Stand With Us Canada and Meryl Cates. But without further ado, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, I greatly appreciate your time this afternoon, sir, and thank you so much for chatting with me.
I'm very grateful to be on. Thank you.
So let's first off talk about what's going to be bringing you to Toronto next week.
Well, I'm in Toronto now, actually. Firstly, I'm filming a new television series for Vision TV. It's called Divine Intervention. It's a family repair show. It helps families that are in crisis. We deal with everything from divorce and infidelity to meaninglessness in life, suicidal thoughts, painful circumstances that people find themselves in. But I'm speaking next week for Stand With Us specifically about Israel and the great battle for Israel in our time. Israel is becoming one of the most hated countries in the world, even though it's the Middle East's only democracy, the only place that respects human rights, women's rights, gay rights. So how could it be so hated? And we Jews have 2,000 years of extreme hatred directed at us. We've suffered a great deal at the hands of this hatred, and now it's being directed at the Jewish state. So I'm going to be addressing the great battle for Israel's name, reputation, and existence in world media and in the Middle East.
One of the big threats against Israel and Israeli enterprise that we see in North America is what's known as the BDS movement, which is boycotts, divestment, sanctions, people that, especially on college and university campuses, seem prone to boycott anything that has any remote connection to Israel. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about why this is seen as such, admittedly by a niche area, but seen as such an acceptable form of protest against a country that, like you just mentioned, is the only bastion of freedom and human rights in the Middle East in so many counts.
Well, BDS is not interested in any kind of occupation. That's just a canard, and it's a smokescreen. If they were protesting an occupation, no BDSer would ever use an iPhone. Apple has been Apple makes their iPhones in China, which has been occupying Tibet since 1951. No BDSer is really interested in Palestinian rights, because if so, they'd be protesting countries like Lebanon, where Palestinians are truly treated as second-class citizens. They are prevented from entering the higher echelons of professions. They would be protesting Kuwait, which has expelled 250,000 Palestinians. BDS is focused on the economic destruction of the state of Israel. It is motivated by Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. It doesn't focus on any human rights abuses that are real. It focuses on human rights abuses that are imagined, that are invented, and that are manufactured. And there are many enemies that are sworn to Israel's destruction: Hezbollah, Hamas, the government of Iran. BDS is just an economic form of that destruction. It seeks to destroy the Jewish state.
Yeah, and I'm glad you really defined it in those terms, because what I find to be so ridiculous about the BDS movement is that it seems to forget that so many of these companies that they claim are part of the problem are employing hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians. I mean, SodaStream is an example of one of the companies that has really attracted much of the ire of this movement, despite how much it does in terms of economic good for Palestinian people.
That's absolutely right. You mean in terms of what Israel has done for the good of the Palestinian people?
Absolutely, but Israeli companies, especially like working within Israel.
Sorry, okay, I'm speaking on the cell phone. I didn't hear. Of course, that's the case. Israel is the best thing that has happened to the Arabs of the Middle East, because Israel exists with its economic freedoms, its religious freedoms, its government freedoms. No Arab dictator can use the excuse that he's withholding those freedoms because they don't work in the Middle East. Because Israel exists, no Arab government can use the excuse that they can't grant women equal rights or allow the population to vote because these things would never work in the Middle East. Israel has given the lie to those excuses. To Israel is the great hope, not just as the Jewish homeland, but for the Arab peoples of the Middle East, that they too can experience the kind of freedoms that the Israeli people have. And that's especially true, as you said, of Israeli companies that employ untold numbers of equal Arab Israeli citizens. Let us recall that 20% of Israel's population are Arab Muslim citizens. That's a very big number. It's 1.5 million. It's the same number of Muslim citizens in a place like Great Britain, even though Israel's population is only 7 million, and Great Britain's population is 80 million. So 20% of the Israeli population are Arab Muslim citizens, and they benefit from a thriving Israeli economy. And Israel's economy is on fire, thank God, because of technological innovation, because of a highly educated workforce, because of some of the world's greatest universities. Not just the best in the Middle East, but the best in the whole world. Israel has some of the best universities in the whole world, like the Technion, like Hebrew University, like IDC, etc.
So, Rabbi, I wanted to ask you, because when I was in Israel back in 2011, it would have been, one of the things that really stood out to me when going through the old city and seeing some of the marketplaces was how many of the Arab people in Israel that you were just mentioning, it was a small number, certainly, but had shops devoted to selling T-shirts that had, anti-Israel propaganda on them and comments critical of Israel. And I found that to be offensive because of the content of it, but a really interesting sort of dichotomy, because I would venture a guess to say that in parts of Gaza, you're not really seeing much that's supportive of Israel. So there seems to be a freedom of speech afforded to Israel's detractors in Israel that's likely not shared by other parts in the Middle East. But I wanted to ask you if you thought that in light of things like this, that Israel does a good enough job at really sort of promoting itself to the world, and if Israel does a good enough job at establishing to people why it is so paramount that its right to exist and defend itself is preserved in light of these, basically in light of these freedoms that exist there and not in other parts of that region.
Well, clearly Israel's not doing a good enough job in promoting its message, because look at how misunderstood it is. Now, no doubt part of that is anti-Semitism. No doubt part of that is an unwillingness on the part of people who dislike Jews and always have to like the Jewish state. So there were people that we're not going to convince, and there were people who we're not going to win over because they seem to have a predisposition toward disliking Israel. But there are many fair-minded and open-minded people who have no such bias, who have no such prejudice, and who have no such predisposition. And our objective is to win them over by communicating much more effectively. Now, I think traditionally Israel has felt that why should it respond to a lot of these lies? No one's going to believe them. Unfortunately, and that's why they haven't made a greater effort at communication and PR. Now what we've learned throughout Jewish history is that no matter what is said about the Jewish people, people do believe it. So if they said that the Jews killed God 2,000 years ago, and most of the Jews at the time thought no one would ever believe this, but people believed it, and a lot of Jews died with the allegation that we killed Jesus, divinity enclosed in flesh. They then said that the Jews poisoned all the wells of Europe during the Black Death and killed 1/3 of the European population. The Jews said, no one would believe this. Nonsense. People believed it, and there were pogroms against the Jews, taking untold numbers of Jewish lives. And now we hear that the only democracy in the Middle East that supports, promotes, and protects human rights, the Jewish state of Israel, is the worst offender in the Middle East when you have governments like Iran that stone women to death, hang gays from cranes. So no one thought that anyone would believe this stuff, but they do believe it, and it's kind of shocking. So we do have to accept that all these lies are going to find their way into the public consciousness unless we respond to them.
What do you see as being ultimately the root cause of global anti-Semitism in 2015, and has the cause really changed over the last 1,000 years?
The root cause of what, I'm sorry?
Of anti-Semitism as it exists today.
Listen, it's debatable. No one really knows. It's the world's oldest hatred, and we don't exactly know why there's so much hatred to our people, so much unnecessary hatred to our people. Some people say it's jealousy, but I don't buy that, because the Jews, for up until modern times, were a poor and persecuted minority. Who would be jealous of that? Some people say the reason is that the Jews are harbingers of a moral message, and the world doesn't want to hear that message of the Ten Commandments, ethical monotheism, with which the Jews are entrusted. In fact, the word Mount Sinai, and the Torah is given on Mount Sinai, literally translates in Hebrew as a mountain of hatred, because hatred descended to the Jews by imparting this moral message. But no one really knows. And it's something that's debated endlessly in academic conferences till this very day.
I wanted to ask you, because you have worn many hats, and one of the ones that's particularly interesting in your book writing has been writing about Jesus, which coming from a Jewish rabbi is a very interesting thing. And I was wondering if you had any comments on the relationship between Christianity and Judaism and Christianity and Israel.
I wrote a book, Kosher Jesus, which examines the Jewishness of Jesus. Christians today are some of the greatest friends the state of Israel has. In the United States, 1 out of 5 Americans is a born-again Christian, evangelical Christian of some denomination. And by and large, they are hugely supportive of Israel, passionate about Israel. It's led to a new era of Jewish-Christian relations, because the Jewish community is immensely grateful to our Christian brothers and sisters for their support of the state of Israel. When we speak of Western values, we speak of Judeo-Christian values, with that hyphen meaning that there's a common culture and a common culture of values and goals of these two great faiths, which is to make the world better under God's stewardship, to accord all people dignity. And I should say that our Muslim brothers and sisters, I'm sure, join us in those goals as well. And Judaism has no argument with Islam at all. Jews lived under Islamic lands, Islamic governments, for 1,300 years. Some fared better and some fared worse. Our beef is with radical Islam, violent Islam, or extremist Islam, which is an abuse of the faith for violent purposes. But what we do really need to see is a far greater number of peace-loving Muslims who want to safeguard their faith from the extremists who use Islam as an excuse to justify their very bloody and ignoble intentions.
When we look at who Israel's enemies are, they are Arab Muslim nations. When we're looking at the broader, more ideological battle of anti-Semitism and its opposition to Israel and to Jewishness and Judaism around the world, is that a narrative that you see as one that's driven by Islamism, by radical Islam, or is there another force at play there?
I disagree that Israel's enemies are only come in the form of Arab Muslim nations. That is true of many of Israel's neighbors, especially radical Islamic governments like Iran, who are dedicated to a genocide of the Jewish people. They want to kill all 6 million Jews in Israel and have threatened repeatedly to annihilate the state of Israel. But look at countries like Britain, where there's so much anti-Israel sentiment. That's not a Muslim nation. It is a large Muslim population. But there's a lot of people who are Muslims who like Israel and wish that other Muslims enjoyed the freedoms of Israel. But then you have regular secular Europeans, or perhaps even Christian Europeans, who have condemned Israel. Look, we had I think it was the Episcopal Church in the United States about a year ago that condemned Israel. That's Christian.
And the United Church in Canada as well.
I'm sorry?
The United Church in Canada as well, very critical of Israel.
Right, so we see many of the mainline Protestant denominations that are being critical of Israel. The point is that anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head in many places, and we're wrong to say that this has a particular Muslim bent. I know many Muslims who tell me how much they wish that Arab nations that surround Israel would be like Israel, would have the same freedoms for women, educational opportunities, economic opportunities, and the same freedoms, of course. But they're often afraid to speak out. They're afraid of ostracization within their own communities. And if they live under tyrannical governments, they're afraid for their very safety. But we have to be courageous and speak out. I want my Muslim brothers and sisters to retake their faith from the radicals and never allow the radicals to defame Islam by portraying it as a religion of violence, which it is not.
We're joined on the line by Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. We'll be in Toronto next week on July 15th for the Beth Torah congregation for a talk presented by Stand With Us Canada. Rabbi, I really appreciate your time this afternoon, sir. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful for being on. God bless you.
That was America's Rabbi Shmuley Boteach joining me in advance of his appearance in Toronto, which, if you get the chance to pay attention to events that are held by Stand With Us Canada, please do. It's a phenomenal organization with a great deal of compassion and respect for Israel and for the movement that includes myself, of people that support it and its right to exist, which sounds like such a common sense statement, but unfortunately in this day and age is not. And one of the things we didn't get the chance to get into in the interview, just because of time commitments, was not only the number of people in the West that are anti-Semitic, but beyond that, the number of Jews themselves that have such an anti-Semitic undertone to a lot of their comments, and at the very least, very anti-Israel sentiments. And these people are trotted out as examples by the anti-Zionist voices. So I'm glad there's a voice like Rabbi Boteach to join me on the line. I've got to take a quick break here. When we come back, more of Lawton Online here on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Welcome back to the program. This is a really, really interesting story. It's one of the ones that makes me, as a, conservative-leaning Canadian, pretty darn giddy. And it takes place in the riding of Liberal Member of Parliament Joyce Murray. Now, Murray is an MP from British Columbia, and she ran an ad in a First Nations newspaper called the First Nations Drum. Now, in this newspaper, she wanted to give a hearty congratulations to all of the high school graduates of the year who were Aboriginal, a very noble gesture. Aboriginal Canadians have, unfortunately, a high dropout rate. Congratulating anyone for graduating is a good thing. In this particular case, it was in a First Nations newspaper, so awesome. So in the square ad, there's a picture of her smiling face with maple leaves in the background and, well, a little bit of a concerning caption. It says, "Congratulations to all 2015 high school graduates. Sobriety, education, and hard work lead to success." And then Office of MP Joyce Murray, address, phone number, etc., as well as her Facebook and Twitter. Now, the NDP candidate in the riding tweeted a picture of this and says, "Why is sobriety the first advice for Indigenous grads? Racist much?" Yeah, I think this is a little bit concerning, to say the least. I mean, this is a Liberal MP. If this were a Conservative, that people would be calling for their heads on a platter soon. Now, then came all of the explanations. Joyce Murray tweeted that she didn't know what was going on. She said she never saw the ad. Then she took full responsibility for it. She wrote, quote, I was not aware of this ad and did not approve content. However, I assume full responsibility and offer my most sincere apologies. Today, I was made aware of a print ad published under my name, which included a completely inappropriate statement. My sincere apologies. Then she tweeted a link to her Facebook post on the subject and said, please see my full apology to all for this unfortunate offensive ad. I regret it occurred. Does not reflect my views. And in her formal apology, she said, quote, today I was made aware of a print advertisement published under my name, which included a completely inappropriate statement about Indigenous peoples in Canada. I'd like to apologize unreservedly for the deeply offensive language in this advertisement. I was not aware of this advertisement and did not approve of its content. I, however, approve or assume full responsibility for what has happened, and I offer my most sincere apologies to those who were offended by this comment. Joyce Murray, MP. Now, I still don't know what happened. I still don't know what actually happened that led the ad to be there. It was a First Nations paper. I don't know if it's a paper by First Nations people or simply a paper for First Nations people. The newspaper has apologized, saying that one of their salespeople wrote the copy. But I don't think anyone's asking the obvious question, which is, what are your salespeople doing writing congratulatory messages from a member of Parliament? So, I mean, it's one thing for Murray to have personally not seen it. I certainly think someone in her staff should have or would have. If you know you've purchased an ad in a paper, you do not at all get to sort of just assume that, yeah, everything's going to be fine. We'll just let the sales team handle it. So that part doesn't make sense to me. Now, there still is the question of who actually wrote this. If this is a bunch of First Nations people running a paper, making a joke, then I think everyone's outrage is a bit ridiculous. If this is a paper merely for First Nations people, but not by First Nations people, then, well, they are going to have some heads rolling on this. Look, I work in media. No ads ever get published without the consent and approval of the person in them. So I don't know why she wouldn't want to write her ads anyway. So something stinks here. I don't know if the paper's covering for Murray. I believe wholeheartedly that Murray herself did not include it because no one would be that stupid. Did not approve it, rather. No one would be stupid enough as a member of Parliament to let this go. But I would venture a guess to say that someone on her staff was likely asleep at the wheel here. Because I don't buy any of these things are as accidental or unfortunate or as deeply regretted as people seem to make them out to be. And this is, when all is said and done, what it comes down to here. You know, when you get caught doing something, whether you did it or not, it's about, oh my goodness, I have to take responsibility. I apologize. I'm wondering why she is taking responsibility if she's blaming the paper. Maybe it's because she knows that someone in her office did see the ad or someone was assigned to seeing it. Look, I mean, this just happened on Wednesday of this week, so I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but I can guarantee you that the opposition party and the government in that riding, the Conservative candidate in that riding, are probably going to have a little bit of fun with this between now and October, and, well, I guess that's the price you pay for not looking at your darn ads before they get published in a newspaper, for crying out loud. Now, because it's a monthly paper, and this is the worst part, they won't be able to publish an apology and a correction until August. So, like another month. And they said they'll try to get something changed on their website by next week. So it's not even really a huge priority for the newspaper, which I think is a bit questionable in and of itself. Oh dear. Don't you just love new media, everyone? We got to take a break here. We'll come back. More of Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. Stay with us.
He's irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
Welcome back to Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. Wanted to move away from politics for a couple of moments and chat about pop culture, which shockingly I know conservatives like to pay attention to. And this is just as an aside, I think one of the big problems with conservatism is that a lot of the times people tend to turn their backs to culture and entertainment, saying, well, you know, that's just leftist. Well, it is, but that means we need to, for even more reasons, start trying to reclaim it and discuss it. But even moving away from that for a moment, Dustin Hoffman made a comment recently in an interview with The Independent in the UK, in which he said in no uncertain terms that, quote, I think right now television is the best that it's ever been, and I think it's the worst that film has ever been. In the 50 years I've been doing it, it's the worst. Now, this was part of a longer interview that dealt with a great deal of other issues, but the sentiment was pretty clear that, you know what, films are now as bad as ever. And I think that a lot of people have talking about this and wade into this discussion, talking about, where the money's coming from in Hollywood, talking about what sells, and you know what, Hollywood has to meet the demands of the market, not necessarily be itself an arbiter of what is the most artistically brilliant piece. And unfortunately, there are people out there that would like that, but let's face it, those aren't always the pieces that get the most money. Conversely, you get the people that are trying to pass off absolute garbage as, pure artistic brilliance, even though it's nothing but, smut and pseudo-porn movies. In any case, I wanted to delve into this question of where Hollywood went off the rails, or whether or not it even has. I mean, Dustin Hoffman is just one opinion. So I'm pleased to welcome to the program the great Rick McGinnis, film critic, and more importantly, fellow Rebel, having had him on the show here as the editor of The Megaphone on TheRebel.media, where I, from time to time, weigh in addition to talking on the podcast, to delve into the remarks of Dustin Hoffman and the realities of Hollywood itself and the cinema industry. Rick, it is a pleasure to have you on the show, sir, my fellow Rebel. Thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, Andrew, how you doing?
Pretty good. So let's talk about, first off, the comparisons we can make between movies 50 years ago and movies today. Is it that they're actually worse now, or is it that we've just forgotten all the bad ones from 50 years ago and we only sort of remember the great ones?
Well, okay, let's take a look back. I'm 51 this year. I'm 51 tomorrow, in fact.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you. So 50 years is something I can actually sort of think about in terms of my own life. And looking back, if we look at movies in the mid to late 1960s, they weren't in great shape. It was actually a terrible period for movies overall from Hollywood. Hollywood was going through an awful sort of economic and creative shakedown period, and ended up recovering somewhat beautifully by the time the turn of the decade happened. When a sort of counterculture wave of rather interesting directors, Coppola, Lucas, people like that, started to make their way into the business, and a lot of veterans of television, oddly enough, guys who'd cut their teeth doing television in New York in the early days in the 50s started getting gigs directing films. So it had a very interesting period then. It's funny that the Hoffman quote about movies, I can't say he's wrong, but what he's saying is actually considered the conventional wisdom nowadays. Everyone knows television right now is actually probably undergoing some kind of second golden age.
And to that effect, it also seems like a lot of the film stars are taking on TV roles now, which I think a decade ago was like the kiss of death for a career.
Oh yeah, your television is where you went to die. And nowadays, it's where you go to basically have a second or even third act in your career. Or even to just have a better career overall if you're a young actor. There's no shame in taking a role in a conventional or especially cable television series nowadays. Everyone knows it's that much better. But we're also dealing with a period. Keep in mind. Right now, things are really strange. I'm not the first person to observe this. Several other people have. What passes for a major budget, tentpole, summer blockbuster film project nowadays is what 50 and 60 years ago would have been considered a B film. Disaster movies, superhero stories. Superhero stories were solely the preserve of Saturday morning serials, the kind of thing that the 10 to 15 minute shorts that you would play at the beginning of a bunch of B films you screened for kids in a neighborhood movie theater in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, that's what superhero films were.
And now they're among the highest grossing.
Now they are, which it is. I mean, you can say all you want about the taste of audiences. I frankly would rather not blame the audiences most of the time. I mean, the fact is that the only thing getting greenlit at budget levels that high are sequels and superhero films and disaster films, essentially, the kind of stuff that were B films in the 50s and 60s, and only in the 70s, essentially with things like Jaws, Towering Inferno, things like that, suddenly became A films. But even at the same time, I watched Jaws the other day. I tend to watch Jaws about once every summer. I don't know. It's a summer film for me. It's the movie equivalent of a Beach Boys record. I don't know why. And so I watched it the other day, and I got to tell you honestly, there's no way anybody would make that film today. Not that film. I mean, we have shark films nowadays, Sharknado or whatever. But Jaws itself, there's absolutely no way we would make that film nowadays. It would not arrive on screen in that form.
Now, why is that?
It's too smart. Jaws isn't actually really a film about a shark. That's the thing that has to be understood. That's another thing you have to understand about early Spielberg altogether, is that, Close Encounters isn't a film about aliens. Jaws isn't a film about a shark. They're about other things altogether. Jaws is actually about the breakdown of authority in America in the post-Watergate period. I mean, you look at the township, the mayor, and the prominent citizens and the head of the newspaper of the little town of Amity, where the shark attacks are happening. The real drama is not Quint trying to take out the shark out on his boat. It's Roy Scheider trying to convince these corrupt small men to shut down the town so that nobody else gets killed, and they can't see anything but their own bottom line. That is the most dramatic part of the film. After that, as far as I'm concerned, it's all just postscript. But you know what? They wouldn't make that nowadays. They would cut that whole part right out, and you'd have nothing but shark attack.
Well, this brings us, I guess, to a bigger question, which I think does play into the question of whether or not we can blame the audiences in a lot of ways. But have we lost the deep meaning and the layered meanings and the depth in themes of movies now? Really, and it's to the point where audiences are only really seeking that sort of top-line thrill.
Well, I can't say they usually survive the production process, I'll be honest with you. There's a lot of factors in play getting a film made nowadays, not only a big film but a small film. There are actors and their egos, there are agents and their egos, there are executives and their egos. I've got a writer working for me at the Megaphone right now who goes by the nom de plume Furious D, and he's a screenwriter in real life, and he's written several times about how there are two essential forces governing Hollywood: the axis of ego and the axis of money. Notice there's nothing about the axis of quality. That has nothing to do with anything. And essentially the two things are always battling with each other, and the really funny part is that if people just wanted to make films that made a lot of money, they might actually end up making better films nowadays, because I think in the end people's taste is such that they'll choose something more interesting, more fun, more rewarding to watch. But there's the axis of ego that seems to overpower everything else, and that essentially leads us to make films that are just committee projects where everybody involved has a hand, everybody has their say, and as a result, the end product is awful. And also, things start to get in like politics.
Yeah, and some of the worst movies I've ever seen are the ones that have been directed by their stars, too.
Well, that's the thing, yeah. Just because you're a great actor doesn't really mean you have a great talent behind the camera. I can't really think of an awful lot of actors who have that talent. And even when they do, I look at who's surrounding them on the project. Like, for instance, Warren Beatty's Reds. Say what you will about the film, it is kind of impressive to watch, but he also surrounded himself with some very, very talented people. I mean, it's your editor, it's your cinematographer, it's your screenwriter, and they can polish your turd up awfully well.
So when we look at a lot of the things and criticisms that have been leveled by people like Hollywood's just making remakes now, or Hollywood's just doing sequels now, or Hollywood's just doing adaptations of books, is that a reflection that people are out of ideas, or is that a reflection of just where the market is?
I think it's a combination of both, and a third factor as well is that people are terrified of new ideas, because new ideas comprise risk. If you try and make a major film based on a new idea, the chances are that at some point it's going to fail. And if it fails, it's going to be considered a precedent. Oh, better not do that anymore. Let's just go back and remake another 70s sitcom or action film or something. I mean, really, let's go back to the Terminator. Well, why not? That's considered a much safer thing to do, to make another film in a franchise where the other films have made an awful lot of money. Or just, let's reboot Batman. Why not? Let's do that again. I mean, it's what, the fourth time Superman, Batman have been rebooted in my own, not my lifetime, in my middle age.
Yeah, I mean, then there's Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man were separated by less than a decade, I think.
Yeah. It used to be you'd have to wait decades for that kind of thing to happen, or people wouldn't bother this kind of stuff because it was considered greasy kid material. You didn't bother adults with this kind of rubbish. But I'll be frank with you as well. I mean, you can't even say to yourself, well, of course, that's just American films. You can see some great stuff from the foreign markets. No, that's not the case either. Foreign films nowadays, especially the stuff coming out of Europe, are really just as bad. It's just that their budgets aren't as high and their filmmaking conceits aren't as franchise-oriented. But the films themselves are actually not very interesting either.
So I guess then the answer is there really a solution to this? Because I would have assumed that ego and money have been driving Hollywood for the last 5 decades anyway. To me, it astonishes me that that's a new phenomenon. You just have more egos and more money at play now.
Well, ego and money have always driven Hollywood.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's just that there were other factors in play, and what influenced ego and what made money were very different as well. Right now, we just have reached a sort of toxic period where the egos in Hollywood are very much existing in an echo chamber. They really only listen to themselves and not to anyone outside. I mean, right now, of course, we're living in probably the most politicized time in my personal memory, where the active aggression between one side of the political spectrum and another is such that there are certain films you just can't make except by accident in Hollywood nowadays. There's a kind of echo chamber mentality that happens within the studio funding process as well. So certain ideas just never even get out there at all. I was just looking at the upcoming trailers in the next while. We've got an unprecedented number of films involving gay love stories coming up, gay rom-coms, gay romantic dramas, that kind of thing, which is wonderful, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I really don't care much about this issue either way myself, but I'm wondering if they're essentially talking to themselves so much they're really not paying attention to the market. I would be surprised if any of these films do well.
Yeah, what I find interesting, this is off the topic completely, but it's interesting when you talk about that Hollywood, despite being the bastion of progressivism and the bastion of forward thinking, has not really presented recently that I can name anyway, an example of a movie that featured a same-sex couple or a movie that featured an interracial couple where that didn't have anything to do with the plot line.
Yeah,
I mean, that would be the ultimate pillar of progressivism, to have a movie about a gay couple that has nothing to do with the fact that they're gay, or have a movie about an interracial couple that's not, like that Bernie Mac movie, Guess Who. But no, they can't do that. They're still stuck in the same sort of archetypal roles, despite how sort of forward-thinking and progressive they're said to be.
Well, they basically feel like they still have a need to rub it in, the faces of us awful racists, homophobes, and sexists who comprise their audience, whereas I'll be honest with you, just living where I do and coming from where I do, no one cares. Really, amongst the people, if you want to use such an odious and condescending term, no one really cares. I think most people who pay for a movie ticket have moved past that point a lot earlier than, for instance, a lot of people who run Hollywood studios have.
So when we look at the quality of cinema today, going back to Dustin Hoffman's comments, are you convinced that there are still a steady stream of good films being produced and being released? Or is that sort of, no, don't even need to finish it?
Short answer, no. I'll be honest, when I took my job at the Megaphone, and one of its sort of side responsibilities is that I go back to reviewing movies again after laying off for a few years, my heart kind of sank, because I knew for a fact that what's hitting the theaters nowadays is terrible. It really is some kind of bad stuff. There's nothing really worth writing about per se. I mean, what you end up writing about when you review a major film nowadays is not the quality of the film. That doesn't take much time at all. It's not very interesting. I mean, it's got a technical quality that's unimpeachable, but it's nothing really interesting. There's nothing happening there. What you end up writing about is what it means, what kind of social trend it reflects, what it says about the prejudices of the people who produced it or made it, what they're trying to tell us in the audience. It's got very little to do with the quality of the film itself, and that, for me, is an awful bloody shame.
When was it that the technical quality surpassed the actual substantive quality of the film in terms of priority levels?
Some point probably between Jurassic Park and the Titanic film. We kind of reached a point where digital technology moved forward in sort of Moore's Law-esque leaps and bounds, Jurassic Park, I mean, it was one. I remember watching it. I mean, I was a dinosaur geek as a kid, so I really wanted to see the film. And when the herds of whatever brontosauri, sauropods, whatever, started walking across the screen, I just sort of went, oh wow. And then looking back at it now, you realize it looks kind of off. It's a little bit thin. The dinosaurs look a little bit transparent. The muscle movement's not quite there. But it was a massive leap forward. By the time Titanic came along, there was this point where you could pretty much do anything. And nowadays, you've got films like, I mean, there was a director who made his name doing a film essentially where aliens land, sort of these alien spores land in Mexico and start growing. And it's a really interesting, it was a very small film, a very indie film. I wish I could remember the title of it. He went on to get bigger films after that. I think he did the last Godzilla film, if I'm not mistaken, the director who did this. And, I mean, this film was essentially made with 2 actors, a small crew in a van, and a laptop. All the special effects, which were these phenomenal-looking, wholly alien-looking creatures who suddenly loom up out of the darkness. The structure of the film is very much like a 50s sci-fi horror alien film where you don't really glimpse these things until later, which is actually the better structure for this kind of film. It was all done on a laptop for no money. They created these things. They just found some random geeks who happened to be very good at this sort of thing and who helped them essentially draw this stuff and put it on film. You can do this stuff for nothing nowadays. Speaking as the part of my, string to my bow is that I'm a photographer. What you can do nowadays digitally, so cheaply, for absolutely no cost whatsoever as a photographer. I mean, I would have been in the darkroom for days trying to achieve the effects I can produce in 20 minutes on sitting here on my desktop with Photoshop. It is truly astonishing what you can do nowadays, and I think that's kind of blinded people. Let me put it this way. It's an awful lot easier to do that than to write a great script and elicit a very interesting, nuanced performance out of an actor. And we always go for the easier thing.
Welcome to Avatar.
Yes.
We got to take a quick break here. Really appreciate your time. Rick McGinnis, editor of The Megaphone at TheRebel.media. Always a pleasure, sir.
No problem. Thank you, Andrew.
When we come back, a little bit more on TheRebel.media. But before we go, I have to say first off that going back to comments I made in my preamble, look, I think we need to reclaim Hollywood. And I get that not everyone has, the backing of a multi-million-dollar studio. So I don't mean that everyone's expected to support movies that aren't being made. But I think in attitude, we need to recognize as conservatives that not everything has to be a political statement. And this is the problem, is that I find a lot of conservatives will take movies, music, TV shows, etc., and assume that it's existing in the political realm, when in a lot of cases it is, but it doesn't have to. I mean, we can look at movies that are good movies. A friend of mine, Steven Crowder, was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he as a comedian has said this, that, conservatives need to stop looking for conservative movies or conservative comedians or conservative songs. Instead, we should look at conservative-friendly stuff, but more importantly, look for good stuff. I don't care if something is conservative or liberal or not. I care that it isn't just something that's there to trash Christians, something that's there to trash conservatives, but I like good entertainment. And you know what? I'll laugh at my own expense. I'll laugh at the expense of conservatives. I'll even laugh at the expense of Christians if it's a really funny joke in a movie. Now, maybe you may object to that, and that's fine. You get the right to decide for yourself what is acceptable and decide for yourself what is not. But you know what? I look at movies like Juno, which is not a pro-life movie in the sense that it's something that's telling people not to have abortions, but it has a pro-life message to it. I look at movies like The Giver, which is something that a lot of conservatives have claimed as being a conservative-friendly movie. But then you look at Atlas Shrugged, for example, which was an absolutely awful movie, despite the fact that the message was the most, conservative, libertarian-friendly message you could ever find in a movie. It was literally an Ayn Rand movie. But the movie itself was garbage. So we need to get behind people who are good, and we need to do this if we want to reclaim anything from the entertainment industry. But more importantly, I think you just need to lighten up and just enjoy stuff. And I don't say that because you're not. I just think that's the one big takeaway. If you get outraged over anything, you're going to quickly find yourself with the liberal-esque outrage meter in your own lives. We've got to take a break here. Stay with us. More of Lawton Online in just a moment.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
You heard the man. It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, scouring every corner of the globe from Vancouver Quadra to Vanuatu and finding the examples of liberal unintelligence in every form. I mean, I don't know for sure if they're liberals, but sometimes there really isn't much left to the imagination on these things. Today, we actually go to Scotland, where the member of a boy band called Rewind, by the name of James McElver, on Wednesday on a flight from London to Glasgow, decided he would avoid paying a baggage allowance fee. You know, those all things anyone who's flown in Canada has to deal with. So much so, he thought he was playing it smart that he decided he would wear all of the contents of his luggage so that he wouldn't have to pack anything. Well, unfortunately, and he posted a picture of himself wearing pretty much everything, looking like Chandler from that one episode of Friends, or Joey rather. Could I be wearing any more clothes? That one. Posted a picture of himself. Does not look comfortable. Certainly doesn't look stylish. In any case, he had exhaustion, specifically heat exhaustion, to the point where he collapsed on the flight. He thought he was a goner, and that he was having a heart attack. Apparently, the paramedics told him, according to BBC, that he was, quote, lucky to be alive, and this all because he wanted to save himself. I think it was like £25 fee. So I think it's safe to say when you are so darn cheap that you wear every piece of clothing you have and end up in the hospital as a result of it and in need of medical attention on an international flight, it's safe to say you must be a liberal. There's really just no other option. We've got to wrap things up for the program today, folks, but we will be back any week now. No, we'll be back next week with more Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.